Cherian, thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We're going to talk today about how to find out what your donors really want so you can better serve your donors and make your fundraising more effective so you can help more people or animals or move your issue forward or help the environment, whatever it is you're working on. But I want to start by framing this conversation around solving a very common problem for nonprofits, a pain point that I'm sure most of our listeners are feeling at some point, and it's actually a problem that's hard to solve. That's why we've got you on the show. And that's this idea that you should be asking your donors for feedback. And most of the common advice in conferences and books from consultants online, it's all about, oh, you don't know what your donors want? Well, just ask them, talk to your donors. And a lot of the advice is about surveys or focus groups or just jumping on a phone and having conversation, which is great. And then of testing, like you have an idea, not sure if it'll work. Oh, just test it. Just go ahead and test it. Always be testing. Now, that all sounds great on the face of it. And it is really smart when it comes to major donors, where you can have those conversations, you can go deep, you can tailor proposals, you can tailor asks, and you can craft giving opportunities around some of the donor preferences. But this is a podcast about building a broad base of donors and inviting everyone, including the $25 donor, to have that same great experience. And personally, that's what drives me. Like, giving should feel great. Philanthropy is for everyone. Let's make giving the best experience for donors at all levels.
But, absolutely.
That's the challenge. The challenge for small and medium-sized shops, which is most charities in the US and Canada and elsewhere, is how do you scale this one-on-one approach when it comes to communicating one-to-many? And if we just ask everyone for their preferences, like we're told to do, we will run into two issues, which I see all the time. I'm sure you see them all the time. The first one is we don't actually have a system that can record everyone's personal preferences in a way that we can meaningfully use. Right?
Yes.
So we end up with way too many preferences. We get frustrated, we'll just pick like a few of those preferences and we'll treat everyone the same way because we think those preferences represent maybe the majority sentiment. And yeah, sometimes that can be okay, depending on the preference. Or number two is if we are able to record and use those preferences, is that what people say that they want is often not actually what they want.
Exactly.
So, and it's not like they're lying to us. They just don't realize that how they think or what they think is not often in line with how they act.
Absolutely.
So, as fundraisers, our job is to figure out a balance between the two of these. Like, yeah, ask for feedback, but mainly observe what donors do and what they prefer and how they react to it and why they react and how they react to it, not necessarily what they say. Now, that's the problem you're going to help us solve today. How's that for a setup?
In 45 minutes. Let's do it. Let's do it.
Well, you are one of the smartest people I know in fundraising, so I'm going to be taking a lot of notes over here. But I know you've got a 3-step framework that you've implemented at the Moines Performing Arts.
Yeah,
that can at least help us get started and think about this. And you're going to walk us through it. Just quickly, step number 1 is to map out your donor journey and all the inputs where your donor is interacting with you. Number 2 is to list all the biases or barriers to the behavior you want your donors, the behavior you want to lead your donors toward. And then number 3 is to actually validate some of the things that you think you can do to help the donor lead them toward generosity and then test it.
Yeah.
So let's start with the first step, which is mapping out all the touch points and inputs. What does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first even before you get to mapping out the activities, it's really the core question is identifying what is the key behavior that you want the donor to do or the prospective donor to do. So that's going to lead you to mapping out the activity. And it may not just be a donor. It may be, for us, it might be a ticket buyer. It might be for a membership organization, signing up for a membership, or for an advocacy organization to participate in some sort of like a rally or to sign on. So just to clarify, this applies to any organization. Now, just to clarify, this is not something that I invented. I have taken some courses with Dan Ariely's group at Irrational Labs, and I'm using that structure that they identified. So just want to clarify, it's not mine. So the first step, and this is honestly where most, whether it's nonprofits or businesses go wrong, is in terms of identifying the key behavior. The nonprofit example is where we say we want higher retention rates. Well, that's really too vague of a behavior.
Mm,
So our question that we want to ask is, or the key behavior we want to define is, as the Dan Ariely's group says, is getting uncomfortably specific with the behavior.
gotcha.
So an example of that that's not nonprofity is the key behavior is order takeout dinner at 5 p.m. tomorrow. So then as you outlined, we want to then look at what are all the pieces that go into ordering takeout at 5 p.m. tomorrow. And in the map that we do for that as a class assignment, there are at least 15 steps involved in that. So a lot of times we oversimplify the process, and I would encourage you. I mean, this is why you would want to work with someone as well, but to identify all the pieces of the behavior that you want your donor or your prospective donor to do. So it's not just click the donate button. It's we want a donor to make a monthly giving or monthly gift through their phone for a particular project, right?
Right.
And so with those things in mind, we want to map out what are the different pieces on their phone that they're going to see, that they're going to react to, but also what are the things happening around the prospective donor when they're making that decision. So are they opening an email? Are they doing that while they're having breakfast? Are they getting that email while they're doing some kind of other work? What are the distractions that might affect how they're following that pathway? And that's where we get to all of the biases that is sort of that second step, or the barriers to them conducting that behavior. So what are the pieces involved in clicking that button? Do they need to have their credit card handy? So if they're having breakfast, maybe they don't have their credit card handy. So then they
Right.
have to. So then the next step is I need to go and get my wallet, get out the correct credit card, and then type in those numbers on my phone. Right. So thinking through all of those different steps are the pieces around that key behavior, and then ultimately that third step is identifying the benefits for the person in making the decision,
Right.
and how can we experiment with different types of benefits to get them to do what we want them to do. And in our coursework, we talk about two types of benefits. One is an immediate benefit, so something that happens quickly. We're short-term thinkers as humans. We don't have a good long-term horizon in terms of benefits. So that's why people don't save for retirement. It's why
Right.
people make bad money decisions generally. But then also a hedonic benefit, so an immediate benefit and a hedonic benefit. And this is something that we describe as very emotional, something that is tied to like making me feel good about the decision that I made. So if you think about dieting, for example, the reason why people don't eat healthy is because it feels good in the moment to eat a shmoo cake in Winnipeg, right? Like it's really tasty, and I want to do that even though it's not the healthiest thing for me.
Right. I appreciate that reference, by the way. You've done your research.
I love the shmoo cake. Every time I'm in Winnipeg, that's a priority for me.
All right. So we're identifying behaviors, and we're also which you mentioned, very important. We're identifying the context for each of these behaviors,
Yes.
because context matters so much. A person may react one way in this situation, in another situation totally different, although the question or problem or ask that they're reacting to is exactly the same. It's just
Yes.
the context around them has changed. So for the purposes of this conversation, and just to keep it simple, um, let's say that so a lot of nonprofits are rushing back to in-person events. That's a whole different podcast. We won't
Yes.
get into
Yep.
that. But let's just say, for the purposes of this conversation, what we're trying to do, because all the donors are going to be in the same context, we're all going to be in one room together, so
Uh-huh.
we can control, for lack of a better word, sort of the context a little bit. Um, we are going to try to get everyone to take out their phone or to take out their phone and then make a gift on a mobile giving page that's going to be on the screen. The URL is going to be right on the screen. We're going to
Yes.
ask everybody to do that. We're going to present a project, an emotional story, then we're going to ask people to take out their phone. If that's what we're trying to optimize for, would we now just like sort of begin with the end in mind and just like engineer backwards all the steps that need to happen and then just put those sticky notes on a wall? Or like, how does it very practically look
Yes.
like for a fundraiser in their shop right now trying to apply this?
Yes, absolutely. So that's the exact way of thinking about it, is figuring out what are all the different steps, and using sticky notes or a whiteboard and putting all of those different pieces together in the workflow, and then saying, okay, here are all the steps involved in doing it, and then aligning benefits to those different decision tree elements, right?
Right.
So one piece, for example, I can tell you that I've seen done well is well, you had Donna Segal on your podcast before, and she talks about heuristics, and there are multiple schools of thought when it comes to decision analysis, but one piece of that is the heuristics that go into us making decisions. So we want to have social proof. So we want to have you want to have potentially people that are pulling out their phones, and so you see other people doing that, but even listing in real time who's making a gift on the screen in the
Right.
room, because that reinforces social desirability bias. So and social desirability bias is our want to look better than who we really are, right? We want to be our best
Right.
selves when we're out in public. So, I put on a collared shirt for you. Those types of things. But those are some of the reasons why, and we'll get to this later, why surveys are challenging. Because if you ask people, how much do you plan to donate this year? Well, I'm going to tick that higher box because I want to believe that I'm a better, more generous person than I
Hmm.
truly am. And so that's an element of, they're not lying. They just want to be perceived as better. And
Right.
so you can lean into that benefit, if you will, or that heuristic in some of these pieces. But yeah, mapping it out just like you would a donor journey or workflow or whatever, but doing it for a very specific decision, and then seeing like walking through that yourself and seeing, does this take a really long time to fill up this form or to pull out my credit card? Because it's not just opening the mobile device. I also have to pull up my credit card, right?
Right.
And make a decision about how much to give, which is why we want to lean into heuristics like defaults, right? So, what is the default amount of money that we're asking people to give? And making it so removing some of those decisions makes it easier to get the prospective donor to do what you want them to do. We're not tricking them, right? They're making the decision on whether
Right.
to make a gift, but we're helping them get there more quickly.
Right. Yeah, we're sort of the guide that's been there, done that. We've climbed the mountain. We know the best way to get up the mountain, and we're going to guide you through this process and help you
Yeah.
avoid any sort of sharp edges and friction. And we're just trying to lead you toward generosity, so that you can be the generous person that you want to be. You said people, they're not lying to us; they want to be generous, and they really
Yes.
do want that for themselves. That makes sense to me. In the event example, as you're talking, I just remember this example of that charity water, and I know that we often refer to charity water as one of the examples, but they've thought through this process at their gala, and they can afford to do this, but they had iPads
Yeah.
for every single person that sat down. There was an iPad in front of them already with the offer and the giving page, and when it was the right time, everybody turned on the iPad, so they didn't even have to take out their own phone.
Yeah.
And there was a
Brilliant.
live stream from a well somewhere, right? And so when you're talking about the immediate benefit, as they were donating and everybody's names and you could see the donations go up, people on the other end were just like celebrating their generosity, because that meant that this well would now get built and get fixed.
It Absolutely. I mean, this was a master class in getting donors to from point A to point B, right? All the people that were in that room were already planning to make a gift, right? They're not coming to the charity water event thinking that maybe I'll give to an art museum or maybe I'll give to an animal
Right.
rights issue. They are there because they have made the decision, I'm going to give something to charity water. So now they're making it incredibly easy to align their intention with that behavior. So the iPad means you don't have to pull out your phone, you don't have to navigate to a particular URL and maybe get it wrong, and all of those things. There are a limited set of options on there, and of course, I think intuitively we all know that well is going to be built. Right? It's not a question of whether that well is going to be built, but
Yeah.
we want to be part of that moment in that social desirability context, right? So, and we get to see in real time, like my dollars making a difference and then them celebrating. So you have both the immediate and the hedonic benefit aligned with that.
Yeah.
And I mean, absolutely a masterclass in how to accomplish those
Yeah.
types of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's of course two things those people in the room were buying. And I actually wish I could have been in that room, to be
Yeah.
honest. But they were buying the well, sure, but they were also buying the story of having been in that room
Yes.
and having been part of
Precisely.
that moment. Yeah. Okay, so we've got a specific behavior that we want to encourage with donors, and let's just say we want them to donate at an event. We've got it all mapped out. We've used sticky notes. Now, step two is to actually list all the biases and all the barriers that may get in the way of donors actually completing that action. Now, we have
Yes.
talked about biases on this podcast a few times with Donna K. We've had Nathan Dorsky on here, and we've just scratched the surface. There's so much there. Um, at the Des Moines Performing Arts, what are the most common biases that you and your team, when you're mapping this out, what are the most common things that you look at, that you start? Like, what's the starting points that you use?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, first and foremost, there are more than 200 heuristics or biases out there. So, our goal is not to walk through every single one of those biases, because that would lead to our own paralysis in terms of decision making. So, there are a few key ones that we look at. One is definitely social proof. That's a piece that you've talked about on your podcast before, but is one that definitely affects whether people give to an organization, because they don't want to be. And this is, if you think about it, this is the reason why capital campaigns are structured the way that they are, where you
Right.
have a private phase, you raise this amount of money, and then you say, well, we're almost there, and then you go into the public phase, because people don't want to be the first ones there. So social proof means we will do things to reinforce you're not the only one, or even sometimes subtly, you are the only one that's not giving, right?
Right.
And then we'll tie that in with things like matching gifts, because that's an element of social proof, or something along the lines of some other biases that play into the, like, we're doing more than collectively than we're doing individually.
Right.
So there's a reason why any person like you in direct mail will always recommend, if we're going to do a campaign, we want to have some sort of matching gift if we can. Like,
Yeah.
that will be effective. Now, what we're careful of, always, the thing in the back of our minds, is reactance, because at a certain point people are like, there's too much going on here,
Right.
and we don't, and they push back against that decision making.
Yeah.
um the other piece is urgency, right? Like, so what I see nonprofits do, and we've done in the past, is sort of this general call for support that has nothing to do with a time bound experience. And people, if in people's brains, if they can delay action, they will.
Right.
So as we're thinking about writing an appeal, doing an event, doing a philanthropic event, not a performing arts
Yeah.
event,
Sure.
or something like that, our view is always, how can we put a sandbox around this and say, what are the pieces that need to be in place for those two things. So the quick example that I can give you is, we were trying to, with a lot of performing arts centers, that there's a big gap between the people who donate and the people who buy tickets but don't donate. So how can we get some more engagement with the people who buy tickets but don't donate? Well, we on a typical Broadway night, we have or a typical Broadway run, we have 8 performances, and there's about 2,400 ish people in each of those performances. Maybe about half of them give, or so, but we can, what we were able to do is pull out the data to say on Friday night, here's the number of people who give or the percentage of people who give and the amount of money that they give. And then we can send out what we did. We sent out a piece of mail that said, um, to prospective donors, more than 60% of people that attend the Friday night performance, like you, give X amount of dollars to support these types of programs. Will you join them in making a gift? Not the exact language, but you get the idea
Yeah,
of,
right,
we're reinforcing the social proof. And then we time bind that to say, like, they're giving money to help launch this initiative to be able to support kids in our community and their access to arts education. Will you allow us to say yes to another kid this fall, whatever it is, right? And that
right,
was wildly successful. It was way more successful than any subscriber appeal that we had done before. And it had a lot to do with specificity. Now, the kind of tie into that, and there's another heuristic around like how we care about the people who are closest to us, right? We're
right,
we're more aligned with the people, and there's a weird element of that bias, right? Because it super depends on the context. Because like if you may not have an alliance with everyone in Canada in general, but when the Canadians are competing in the Olympics, then you're a Canadian, right? Like that's where your identity
right,
forms. But if it's like the Winnipeg football team, right now you're opposed to other people in Alberta or in Ontario or wherever, right? So there's an element of how you craft that community. So one of the things that we did was we looked at where all of our kids' performances, where kids were coming for those performances. So my kid's local elementary school was coming to a performance. So we took the zip code, the postal
right,
code of all of those people in that area who were in our database, and created one that was for the existing donors, one that was for prospective donors, and we said, these kids have access to this performance because of you. Thank you so much. A stewardship piece, just a gratitude piece. Then for the prospective donors, we said there are 4,000 people in the city that have made it possible for these kids to attend this performance. Will you join them in making this possible for another class, for that type of thing, and
right.
again, time bounding it and stuff like that. So kind of pulling in not just like a generic social proof of lots of people are doing this, but getting really specific into that relationship bias, that community bias. Like we're one of this is what we do. We care about our community and our neighbors.
Right. Yeah, and it's not. I mean, this is very possible for a lot of nonprofits, a lot of local nonprofits. It's fairly easy for you to just analyze your zip codes and
Yes.
go by neighborhood and be like, right now, hundreds of people in your neighborhood are are helping buy meals for the homeless this Thanksgiving. Are you
Yes.
going to join your neighbors who are on your street or living on your street and they're giving to make this happen? Are you going to join them? Um,
And Mike, one of the greatest examples, not from Des Moines Performing Arts, but a kid came to the door recently, and whoever taught him the script was masterful. He walked up to the door and he said, "Hey, I'm raising money for X, Y, and Z, blah blah, and I've got that neighbor over there, and I've got that neighbor over there, and that person's given me $50, and this other person's given me 100." I mean, like very clear social proof, like social desirability bias in terms of like the neighborhood, but also he pegged the default in terms of like what the range is, right? So Donna mentioned like our priming, the priming heuristic.
right,
And there are great examples. Like I saw Bernard present once, and I've stolen this for my presentations as well, where you present a really big number and you have them do a simple math calculation, and their numbers are way higher. Bernard uses the example of like chugging on the streets of New York and asking people for
right,
donations. And if you're further north where the street numbers are higher, the average donation's higher. I mean, we're kind of keyed in to making to we just don't know how much things cost. So that's why having multiple examples on your website of $14 pays for this, $28 provides that, $72 provides that, but then giving a default assumption of like $28 and highlighting that in a different color are very simple things that any nonprofit can do, but it sort of guides my eye and my thinking towards, oh, I can do $28 a month. That's an easy thing to do. And just simple elements of design with color and words can change your average gift rate tremendously.
Right. Yeah. So we're gonna look at social proof, which is who else is doing similar behavior. Like people like us do things like this. The Seth Godin sort of mentality. We're gonna look at just at unity, which kind of plays into the social proof. We're gonna get really really specific. Instead of asking a donor to, I don't know, help provide vaccines to children in some village, we're going to say next month we're setting up a mobile clinic, and on this day we're planning to vaccinate 350 kids. And so reply by that date, so we can vaccinate 350 kids,
Yep.
and then we'll send you a picture of the day a few days later, so you can see how your donation went to work. Just get
Yeah.
really specific, provide immediate benefits, hedonic benefits that you talked about in the previous step. I think this is something almost any nonprofit can apply without. I mean, this is changing the words that you use. Words are free. This is
Yes.
not going to cost you anything extra. It's just changing the way that you talk about things, and trying offers in a different way.
Yes. Absolutely.
All right. So number 3, the last step is now that we've mapped out the behavior that we're trying to lead a donor toward. We've mapped out all the biases that might hinder or might help, and we've got a bit of a hypothesis of how we're going to do this. Okay, and so number 3 is now to validate.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we're going to talk about preference analysis here. There are 2 problems that sometimes happen when nonprofits try to validate something. The first is test everything, right? You should be
Yeah.
testing at all times. Well, in traditional A/B testing, so often your result will not be statistically significant, and you
That's
may
right.
not even know it. Like if you have a list of 5,000 donors and you've been told to test, and you test something and you get a result and you think, oh great, I got a result, well, chances are you actually won't be able to trust that test. You won't have the response and the volume needed for that test to be meaningful. Now, I think you can still learn from tests if you stack them on top of each other and do it enough times. You can get some intel out of it. But most of the time, like if it's not statistically significant, it means that your chances of replicating it are very, very low. Now, number 2 is
That's right.
that testing can also present a huge opportunity cost. If you are expecting to raise $100,000 from your year-end campaign, which might be for a small shop a significant chunk of your budget, now you're going to introduce a test. Half of your list gets an experimental treatment, and now your campaign only raised $70,000. Because your experimental
Yeah.
treatment didn't work. You lost money
Yeah.
by testing. So for smaller orgs, how can we validate? How can they test?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm glad we started there because I think part of it is, can you actually do the test? Do you actually feel like you have the ability to do it? And if you just, if you run, there's so much advice out there to just test your subject line, test the offer, test the ask string, whatever. And those are reasonable assumptions, but to your point, it can leave lots of money on the table. And is a huge opportunity cost. And so the first piece of advice that I give to organizations is the advice from my high school coach, which is beg, borrow, and steal. So people have done tests before on these issues. Take their tests and use what they have learned to your benefit. Just
Right.
copy other test results and start from there. So you don't, as a small, mid-sized nonprofit, you don't have to start with, should I use a live stamp? Should I not use a live stamp? Don't test that. The live stamp performs better. I'll tell you this right now, right? Does handwriting perform better than on the outer envelope than a pre-printed label? Yes, it does. So this is stuff that consumer businesses have tested, as well as plenty of nonprofits have tested. So you can go out and you can find this research. You can see what has been tested, has validity from scientific or academic sources, and have a starting point to improve your best practices. And for most small, mid-sized nonprofits, this is sufficient, right? This will
Right.
get you to where you need to go. Another example is on the inside salutation, dear friend, dear supporter, dear donor, right? The reason why that is not successful is not because of some kind of esoteric piece. It has everything to do with how our heuristic biases develop when we open that piece of mail, right?
Right.
We look at it and we see our name, and immediately it triggers a different element of our brain, right? And um, including testimonials or single stories in the appeals, those all they work because of the decision analysis, the behavioral science around some of these things. So you're probably hearing all of these pieces of advice on your podcast and blog posts and things like that. But so taking that research and applying it is absolutely the first step. The next step, I think, is taking where you can to inform those first choices, right? So you've done the best practices. Now, where are you seeing some places in your map, in your specific map, where the decision isn't happening the way you want it to happen?
Right.
Right? People aren't clicking the button. They're not opening. Well, you don't necessarily know if they're opening the mail, but they're not responding to the direct mail piece. That's when now you would go back to the first step and re-engineer that process and then say, okay, in my nonprofit, in my organization, what are the particular things that we need to validate in order to get to the success, the key behavior that we're looking for?
Right.
So for us, for Des Moines Performing Arts, one of the things that we're constantly looking at, especially right now, is the planned giving element, right? Like, how do we figure out legacy giving? We have people that give us legacy gifts, but the palpitations that I get is when we find out that we have a legacy gift after the person passed away, and
Right. Yep.
we had no idea, and we didn't steward that person. And people in finance are like, "Yay, money!" and I'm like, "No, this is a disaster.
Yeah.
This is terrible," and I'm stress eating down the hallway. And so what we're looking at, so first, you borrow the research from Russell James that talks about living donor testimonials. Why? He's done the actual brain scans to see that works from an EEG or EKG perspective.
Right. Yeah, he's literally gone inside the mind of your donor.
Yes, right, and he has the pictures to demonstrate that.
Yeah.
Now we can do some of that with eye movement tracking and facial expressions and stuff like that. But he's already done that research, so we know the first step to do, right? So we do living donor testimonials. We do some of these other pieces that people have taught us will work. And we start with that assumption. And now, as we're relaunching, kind of rebranding and relaunching our Legacy Giving Society, we want to see, do people respond to these different pieces? And we're going to validate against all of those by testing very specific behaviors, like, what are the benefits associated with a Legacy Giving Society that people align with? Not just like a tangible benefit, a rocking chair or an umbrella or whatever you get from it, but what are the emotional benefits that people are aligned with? Now, again, this is a place where a lot of the advice that you're hearing is really bad because it's a tool jammed into a hammer when you need a screwdriver. Right. So if you survey your plan giving donors and you ask them what type of recognition would you want, a lot of them are going to say, "Oh, I don't need any recognition." But we know that recognition does have an important piece. For some people, absolutely, they want to remain anonymous. We want to let them do that. But what are the recognition pieces that will drive them to make a planned giving decision or a regular decision, right? And so Leisha talks a lot about this and nudging planned giving donors in different directions, but you want to start kind of testing those pieces. And to your point, then, as we talk about preference analysis, what Fortune 500 companies figured out a long time ago is that you can't ask people what they want. If that were the case, we would never have an iPad.
Right.
No one would have said, we need an iPad. Right. But when
we wouldn't have a car.
Yeah, that's right. People would have been fine with a faster horse. Right. there are so many examples of where innovation that we take for granted actually didn't align with people's stated preferences. And that is so true as we look at, especially during the pandemic, uh, people's behaviors against what they say their behaviors would be, for example.
Right.
And even before the pandemic, a really good example of that is Tom Ahern would talk about this all the time in presentations. If you survey your donors and ask them if they want a print newsletter or an email newsletter, they'll all say email newsletter. They'll
Right.
never read it. And we objectively can see that, right?
Yeah.
Will they actually say that they want to print one? No, but will they read it? Yes. And that's what we care about.
Right. So
So,
how do we get into preference analysis then?
yeah. So that's a great question. There are tools out there. There's a website called conjoint.ly, ly, that does preference analysis. There's services like Qualtrics that do conjoint analysis. And without getting into too much of the science behind this, there's a whole science developed by Dr. Howard Moskowitz that I worked with directly to understand how he's applied this over the last 40 years for Fortune 500 companies. If you all are listening to this and you have time, I would just recommend you watch this TED Talk from Malcolm Gladwell. He was supposed to talk about his book, and he gets up and starts talking about Howard and how Howard has really changed the world in terms of understanding how our brains work.
Yeah.
And the quintessential example from Howard is there was at one point there was one kind of spaghetti sauce out there, and this is what people thought. And to your point of like surveying donors, I'm sure they surveyed people and said this is what spaghetti sauce should be like, and they made that spaghetti sauce and it sold fine. When Howard did an analysis for one of the larger spaghetti sauce companies, he discovered that there was actually a very significant portion of the population that was buying the regular spaghetti sauce but didn't actually prefer it. They preferred chunky spaghetti sauce. So he presented his findings to the company and they said, well, let's develop the chunky spaghetti sauce. And they did, and it was wildly successful. And that's why you have literally because of Howard, that is why you have things like chunky spaghetti sauce and different types of pickles. And you
Right.
walk down the food aisle in your grocery store, and many of those things are because of him. Likewise, credit cards. Credit cards didn't have like cashback offers. They didn't have rewards programs. They didn't have those types of things back in the day. They were just, functional, and nobody really wanted them because they were just sort of functional. And what he figured out is, well, if we add benefits like cash back or we add travel rewards, that will entice different groups of people. And
Right.
so what we do in the company that I work with is we develop for nonprofits in particular. I only work with nonprofits to say what are the kind of preferences and attributes that we would test. And we don't ask people questions. We present them with statements that they react to, and they don't just react to a binary set of choices like they do with an A/B test. It's called conjoint analysis, or this multivariate regression, where they have a number of choices and they look at this grouping and they rank that grouping. And then on the back end, our science is able to pull out the elements to say that's the one that drove, because you're seeing this multiple times.
Gotcha.
They pull that one out and say that's what actually resonated. Most importantly, you can tell, oh, Mike, not specifically Mike, but this group liked this thing, but very much did not like that thing.
Right.
So you know
So
what motivates and what
if I'm understanding you correctly,
right?
you just like keep presenting people a bunch of statements that they're reacting to. So they
Yes.
react to a statement, you give them the next statement, and they just keep going for, I don't know, 5 minutes or so.
Yeah,
Um,
it's less. Yeah, it's usually
okay.
less than five. Yeah, about 5 to 7 minutes, I think.
Okay.
So we do a 4x4 square, so four dimensions, and then four attributes under each of those dimensions. So
Gotcha.
16 different scenarios, if you will, and they get presented multiple times in
Okay.
multiple iterations.
And in the back, you do a bit of a regression analysis. You start to see some patterns, and without people knowing, their answers actually started like putting them in a certain spot on the map. Like,
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Um,
So the example that I can give you very quickly, we did this for a zoo to understand what would transition someone from a non-member to a member of the zoo, and then what would transition them from a member of a zoo to a donor of the zoo. So we tested, we built out the attributes with the zoo, tested them out with people that weren't their donors. This is the important part. So your example of you testing out this direct mail piece and you lose $30,000, well, that's a significant loss. What we can do is test people in your geographic area that they don't know that they're answering questions about Des Moines Performing Arts. They just
Right.
know that they're answering these questions. But now we have localized and statistically relevant data on here are the two different mindsets in your community, or the three different mindsets in your community or in your donor base without them making a decision, right? They're
Right.
not deciding in this moment to donate. We're just understanding
Yeah.
their preference. And now we can say, here are the three groups of behaviors that we can, and the language associated with that we can push out. Because we can find out if a particular way of wording something resonates versus another way of wording something. So can we try, will you support this? Will you invest in this? Will you donate to this? Will you make a gift to this? We can see within your donor base and not actually have them donate, or within your geographic area, or just generally in the United States. What are the things, or in Canada, wherever? What are the things? What are the preferences around particular verbiage? And that then lends itself to basically building out your landing page or your direct mail or your email or
Right.
whatever.
Well, Cherian, this has been such a pleasure. It's been a great learning experience for everyone listening, including me. There's so much to get into here, specifically on this point number 3 here. Will you come back sometime on the podcast and we can continue this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love it. I think this is great, and I would just encourage your viewers. Don't feel like you need to go through all the high tech tools. Just do the best you can with what you have, and adopt those best practices because they do make a big difference.
Right. So before we let you go, we ask every guest on the show if you have a word of encouragement for all nonprofit leaders and fundraisers who are listening, who are doing the hard work of building good in our world and in our communities day in and day out.
Yeah, so I mean, I am so I'm so impressed with the work that nonprofit fundraisers and people that are working in programs do on a daily basis. I mean, living that life as I am right now, especially through COVID, it's hard. It's hard work to stay motivated, to stay encouraged, and I think we've seen the entire sector rise to the challenge. So, what I would just say is, for each of you that's listening, hopefully you're not getting discouraged or overwhelmed from the advice from today, but I would just remind you that there is work out there that has already been done for you, and you don't have to feel like you're doing more work to get to where you need to be. You can take the work that's already been done, apply a lot of it, and then figure out what are the minor repairs that you all need to do to make your particular shop successful. And most importantly, I just want to thank you, your listeners, for what they do, because I believe in the nonprofit sector and its value, in making people's lives better, in truly building good. So thank you all for what you're doing, and just encourage you to keep fighting the good fight.
Yeah, I agree with you. You're so right. Our sector, I'm just so proud of the nonprofit sector during COVID and fundraisers who stepped up. A lot of other sectors, for the first time, found out what it meant to operate under constraints.
Yeah,
And we saw that they didn't like it and they didn't do well with it. And our sector has often, not always, but often been operating under constraints. We've been operating as startups, basically, who are bootstrapping stuff. And
yep,
so the innovation, the resiliency, and just people's spirit that came through. And a lot of people made it through COVID because of nonprofits, and I'm just so
that's right.
proud. I'm just so proud of everybody in the sector. I think this was a fantastic moment where everybody stepped up. Cherian, where can people find you if they want to know more? If they want to start to get into this stuff a little bit, or just learn from you, where can people find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So the best place to find me is either on LinkedIn or Twitter. I try to post there regularly, and any content that I will have on any of these subjects will eventually be there. But I'm also building out kind of my own website at cheriankoshy.com. That will be in a little bit, but all of that content will be there as well.
Well, Cherian, thank you for coming on the show, and thank you for your generosity of spirit and sharing with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.